My name is Harold Davis. I'm a photographer and writer. As Jeremy has said, I would like to conduct this webinar session as much like a live workshop as I can. So please don't hesitate to send your questions Jeremy's way, and he'll point as many of them as possible at me. If something that I show you brings up something that is a question for you, please do let us know, because that's part of the point of being on a live session as opposed to watching a recording. Again, as Jeremy has said, I'm at work on a book called Achieving Your Potential as a Photographer or a Digital Photographer. And this is based on a workshop that I've given. So it includes sessions essentially on how you become a more deep and better photographer. It's about the work of photography and art, and it's also to some extent about how you get your work out there in the real world, how you position it, maybe even possibly how you market it, but this is not fundamentally a marketing book or a marketing webinar. The question of how you position your work out in the world is related to the question of how you become someone who taps the inner sources to create deeper work. I'm running briefly through a few of my other Focal Press books. The most recent one was called Monochromatic HDR Photography, and then the next slide shows some of my other book titles from Focal Press. If you would like to reach me or ask questions after this webinar, please do feel free. You see my email address up there. You can also find out more about me on my blog. You can also subscribe to an email feed and a blog by email feed at the address that's indicated there. And I do, of course, also do workshops and at various places around the world. So to start with, we learn about how to relate to the world and how to create images that are important in the world by understanding oneself a bit. The question of who am I is a very important question. Of course, as you can see in this image where I took a shot of myself looking in a mirror and then drew on it in Photoshop, it's not always something that needs to be taken all that seriously. Who you are and who I am can be the subject for jest, for fun, and it doesn't have to be something that's like, okay, I'm coming down from the mountain with a tablet of prescriptions that says what you want to do, but you do want to have a clear notion of the values that are important to you, because photography and art is a reflection of who we are, and if we don't have self-knowledge, we're not going to be able to present something that has an integrity and a clear path. This is a photograph showing the light at the end of the tunnel. No, actually underneath a pier here in San Francisco Bay in Berkeley, near where I live. Now, many people photograph the top of this pier. What is not so noticed and not so photographed is that you can go through a small hole in the rocks and come at low tide to a place that is inhabited by crabs and rats, and put your tripod and camera there and photograph the progression of the pier stands out to infinity at the end. I include this here to say that as a photographer, I'm willing to go to great lengths. I mean, if I have to go down and inhabit a marginally safe area that's wet and full of rats to take a photo, I will do that. I don't care. The next picture looks like a giant sandcastle, but in fact it is not. It is a full-scale Casbah on the part of Morocco that's across the Atlas Mountains at the border of the Sahara. The object of the point of showing this image is that to get here I had to climb through the crumbling sandstone of this place, reach a very high point at sunset, cross the river you see in the background on stones. So as a person, I'm a stubborn person who is prepared to overcome obstacles to make photos, and I think that's part of what you have to be if you're going to achieve the best potential you can as a photographer. So bullet points about me. And I think what's significant here is not the professional credentials, but also to note that my family is extraordinarily important to me, that I'm the father of 4 kids and husband to a beautiful wife, and I would never be able to present my own worldview and what's important to me without those credentials as well as the professional ones. But of course, like any workshop, the question, if you're looking at achieving your own potential, is not who am I, but who are you? So Ansel Adams, among the many wonderful things that he said and the many wonderful photographs that he took, said that the most important piece of equipment in his bag was a notebook and a pencil. Paradoxically, words are very important to photographers. Words tell us what we're looking at. Words tell us about how to think about things. It's a very good idea when you're going around photographing or when you're thinking about photographing to take a moment and jot down what your idea is. What's the idea behind here? What are the words that are important? The great photographer Edward Weston kept detailed daybooks, which you can read to this day, which are sort of accounts of the meta-thinking behind many of his images and also his life and loves. My own daybook, updated for technology, is really my blog. I've got about 4,000 stories in it by now. I've been keeping a sometimes daily blog story since early in 2005, so there's quite a lot of material there about my thinking. My point here is that I encourage you to, one way or the other, adopt a form of writing and thinking about words related to your photos that are important to you. As we'll see later in this presentation, photography is essentially a form of narration or narrative that's frozen in time. So if you're talking about narration, words become extremely important. Here's a self-portrait with some words, and the next slide shows what happens when you put some odd words into English. They're not always what the people who wrote them think they are. So about a year ago, I hiked the Kimono-Kodo Pilgrimage Trail on the Kii Peninsula in Japan. So it's a World Heritage Trail. It's pretty well signposted. And the funny thing is that you try to verge off it and you get signs that say like that, not Kimono-Kodo. And here's another set of signs in Japan showing you not to feed the sacred deer in Nara, Japan, and what might happen is bite, kick, butt, or knock down. I like to consider serendipity as an important factor in photography. You can be very deliberate about taking an assignment. Sometimes you might have a client who gives you an assignment, or you might have a workshop where they say, where Harold comes and says, okay, here's your assignment. You will go photograph something red. But the smartest thing to do is to consider this assignment like a old-fashioned quest that's been given to a knight. And you go out on your quest, but you don't know what's going to happen while you're doing it. Things might come from left, things might come from right, and you might end up doing something completely different than when you started. If you're not open to the forces of chance, you're missing a great creative force in making your photography more powerful. So this dragonfly in my garden is a chance photo, basically. I was there, I had a tripod and a macro lens. The dragonfly lights on the piece of grass, and I happen to be there, and I take the photo. I went into this cathedral in San Francisco, and there was an art installation with streamers coming down in the center of the cathedral, and somehow the light hit it in just the right position. So there I was, and I said, all right, I thought I was coming in here to photograph the stained glass, but that's really not it at all. It's the way the light hits these streamers. Often the most interesting photos you can make of a place show it from a strange and serendipitous angle, like this image of the Gothic Quarter in Barcelona, Spain, out from the deck of my hotel window, looking straight down, because this shows the narrowness of the streets and the chance that I had that view with a nice wide-angle lens. Focus means many things to photographers. Focus means what we do with our camera, or these days what many of us do on autofocus and where the camera decides to put its focus. But more importantly than that, it means what's the subject of your photograph? What do you focus on with the photo? I like to say, don't bury the lead, L-E-D-E. This is a newspaper term, and the lead, L-E-D-E, in a newspaper story is what's the main thing in your story. If you don't know what the main thing is, you don't know what the focus is, and you don't know what you're writing about. So coming back again to the making notes about your photos, one thing you ought to be trying to determine as you do this is, what is the photo about? Where is the point of focus in the photo? And both manifestly in terms of photographic focus and more metaphorically in terms of what's the main important thing about the focus. So in this shot in the streets of Paris, the actual literal focus is on the background signs of like restaurant and creperia or whatever, but the focus of the meaning of the photo is on the ghost-like people created through a long time exposure. With this abstract image here, the focus is intentionally thrown off, so the image is, technically speaking, entirely out of focus, and the point of the abstractions here are to create something that's interesting with patterns of light and dark and moving light through the lack of focus. So think carefully about focus in your work, both and as a manifest idea and also as a technical concept. The focus here is very clear at the apex of the triangle, and it's an image that's entirely in focus due to high depth of field. But what here's the subject? Is it the reflection? Is it the triangle? And with an image like this of the skyline of Paris with the Eiffel Tower, clearly the focus is the city of Paris at an infinite distance. So the difference between a shot like this one with a moonrise over Port Oakland in California, is the focus on the boats? Is it on the moon? Is the image entirely in focus? Understand where your focus is and know that you have to present an image that shows people that you care and are concerned about the focus in your work, both technically speaking and also as an idea. One side comment here before I move on to being present in the moment is, people ask me how I focus so precisely from the technical viewpoint, and for the most part, I do not use autofocus on my camera. I have found that autofocus causes more problems than it solves, and I like to control my point of focus since it is one of the major creative controls for photographers. But that said, the technical issue of focusing on your own without all the wonderful aids that the camera manufacturers give us these days has some tricks and techniques that you do need to learn to do it effectively. These are perhaps things that the photojournalists in the 1950s and 60s knew well but have been forgotten. To be a good photographer and to do what you can do, you must be there in the moment. So being there is a key concept for a photographer who wants to achieve their potential. If you drive by a wonderful scene like this near the Green Gulch Zen Monastery in the Marin Headlands of California and say, oh, I'm too busy to stop and explore the wonder that is present in front of me, then you're not being there. If you crawl your way out to the edge of the Great Horseshoe Bend in the Colorado River near Page, Arizona in the middle of the night, then to really make an image of star trails falling on the river, you need to be present. You need to be fully aware, and you need most of all not to fall off the 300-meter or 1,000-foot edge down to the river, which at night seems like a real possibility.
Harold, this is Jeremy. Just seems a good point for a question that's come in, which is asking you, do you create a story after you have taken the photo and when you get back to the studio, e.g. with digital software to enhance or edit the image?
Well, that's a really great question, Jeremy. Thanks for breaking in. The answer, well, you know, when I give workshops, at some point in many workshops, somebody raises their hand and says, "Harold, was that image photoshopped?" And I say, "Okay, the answer to that question with my images is always going to be yes." Okay, because I do enhance and work on my images digitally in almost every case. Now, an untold truth here is that with the exception of some photojournalism, almost every image you see published has also been worked on. So perhaps part of this is simply that I'm being more straightforward than many professional photographers who won't admit the extent to which they do work. So my belief is that a digital image is one part computer and one part photography, and that both parts are important in this partnership. But you know, the question was also asked about telling a story, and yes, sometimes I know the story and the lead in advance while I'm creating the image, but at other times the story isn't apparent till many months afterwards when I'm looking at the image on my big monitor in my studio. I don't think you really know your images till you see them blown up quite large. So I recommend everybody getting as big a computer monitor as they can afford for working on their images. Thank you for the question, a good one. So letting go is related to serendipity. Sometimes you just have to let happen what's going to happen. With this image, I was photographing a wave with my tripod on the camera. It's about a 30-second exposure at dusk. And all of a sudden, a really big wave came up, and it was clear that my nice, expensive camera was going to get ruined if I didn't move it. So I quickly picked it up, ran through the surf, and put it down on the sand. So really what happened was there was a start of an exposure, the camera was in motion, and then there was the second half of the exposure, and you get an effect like this. The same thing happened in this photograph of the Golden Gate Bridge from Baker Beach. In other words, there I was happily with my camera on tripod photographing the bridge. A wave comes, I move the camera and let it complete the exposure from terra firma. You can see in this shot the two more stable versions of the bridge with the movement of the camera in between. From a technical viewpoint, this raises the issue that if you're capturing motion in your images, it can be the motion of the subject or the motion of the camera. But leaving that aside, you have to say, when something like this happens, well, do you see if the result's interesting, or do you just throw it away because it wasn't the image that was planned? If you look at the history of art, like the Dadaist movement and other art in the 20th century, you'll see that the idea that chance is an important part of artwork has been important to the history of the 20th century. And I'd suggest that when things come up, you judiciously consider adding them to your repertoire of photographs. The question of how you make something that is a great photo really depends on inner voice. This is an issue of understanding yourself, perhaps of spirituality, perhaps of knowing who you are, which is where I started this presentation. It's surely not an issue of equipment, because people sometimes are, since I am a fairly technically sophisticated person, people are sometimes surprised when they talk to me and I say, you know, it really isn't important what camera you use. It's important that you have something to say. So when I look at creating photos or images, I often look to say, well, what is the sense that I'm creating here? What's unique about this? It doesn't necessarily matter to me if the end looks like a photograph. For example, this image of an antique workbench probably looks more like an etching than a photo, but what I wanted was to create the feeling of the solitary light on the image. And these mountains in the Panamint Range toward Death Valley, again, what I wanted to create was a sense of immense mountain on top of mountain. because that's sometimes how I see the wilderness and how it's so important to me with the rays of light coming from the left. Um, why can't we access that inner voice? And why can't we live up to our potential as photographers? A key concept that I like to work with, and I like to help people in my workshops work with, is resistance. Um, what is resistance? Well, a good definition is that it's that which stops us from doing what we want and need to do. It takes many, many forms. It could be, I've got to get my kid to school. That might be a sort of legitimate form of resistance. It could also be, well, I'm not good enough, or I'm not ready to do that yet. So many kinds of resistance just have to be worked through. I'd recommend a book by a writer called Stephen Pressfield called The War of Art, which is an exploration of how you overcome your own resistance, as something that's helpful in this area. Everybody experiences resistance. It's universal in every field of life. It's not just photography. The question is how you work to overcome it. So one of the answers to that is just do it anyhow. The idea of resistance is also found in the physical universe. These dynamo wheels in the great power stations for San Francisco's cable car are run by these wheels. The chains pass over the wheels, pass down to the cable cars, and the amount of friction is what that lets the cable car wheels go, means that this power has overcome resistance. You look at something like Anton Gaudi's incredible Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, Spain, and here's something where an incredible amount of resistance was overcome, and this work is still a work in progress. You look at it, it is cranes going up. It's about 60 or 70 years in the making and 30 years more to go, and yet an incredible amount of resistance has been overcome. If we didn't overcome resistance as people, as artists, as photographers, we would never have anything. So this is a key concept. To make this image of dawn in a relatively primitive rice field in rural Japan, I had to get up out of a warm, cozy futon on the ground and leave and go out in the icy morning. And you know, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to stay in bed and be warm and maybe take a nice hot bath in the nice hot Japanese bathhouse that was next to where I was staying. But on the other hand, if I did that, the clouds that you see in the valley down below had maybe another 5 or 10 minutes to be there, and I wouldn't have been able to make the image. An image like this one with a temple required see how the water flows in the background of this image? What that meant was I had a long neutral density filter on my camera, so the exposure was for minutes. So much of the photography that I do involves having a great deal of patience and staying in one place for a long time. The issue there is that I am not the world's most patient person. So one of the parts of resistance that I personally have had to learn to overcome is how to be much more patient, both with people and things and the physical universe out there. If I'm not patient, I won't come back with the images that I want to come back with. This is the Gem El Fana, the place of the dead, or central marketplace in Marrakesh, Morocco. And in the Gem El Fana, you'll find snake charmers, dentists with their teeth samples on the rugs in front of them, some delicious food stalls, and people trying to sell you everything and harass you in every which way you can imagine. It's quite a sensory overload place to be for a while. So my resistance with this image was after I'd been there about an hour, and as it started to get dark, all I really wanted to do was get the heck out of there. I didn't want to find my way up to a balcony, put the camera on the tripod, understand how to expose properly, and have the patience that it required to be there for hours more. Think of overcoming resistance as a butterfly coming out from yourself and going to new horizons. So an important part of all photography is narrative. There's a story you're telling. What is the story? Do you know what the story is in your images? Images are a static cut in time, but there is a story there, and whether it's people on the street in Cuba, as in the last photo, or a Parisian model, as in this one, there's always something going on that's a story, and if there isn't narrative behind the photo, it's probably not going to be very interesting to people. People want stories. What is the story? If this is my wife and youngest daughter a few years back at a business meeting. Clearly, they didn't think much of it. And then again, a story can be a romantic change-up of things, like this gorgeous model who was in a reflective mood as I did this in-camera multiple exposure, or this in-camera multiple exposure of women perhaps turning into some kind of animal or deity. You don't always have to know what the story is exactly. A story can be aphoristic, and it can also contain elements that are mysterious, but there should be a story. I want to make this point with a iPhone shot of through a wet window in a rainstorm in Rabat, Morocco, that I'm not somebody who's stuck up on what equipment you're using. An iPhone camera can be a great way to make a photo that tells a story. The key issue is learning about the stories and how to tell them, not about what equipment you use. And here, this is a floral arrangement. It's basically a still life shot on a light box, and there's a story here too. But what is the story? That's for me to know, maybe, and you to find out. I have a pretty good idea about it. But do you know what the stories are in your own images? Jeremy, are there any good questions at this point? This is a good point for a sort of pause. I'm about to shift direction here.
That's perfect timing, Harold. A few good questions have come in. One question is that you've mentioned digital painting, and someone has asked, could you explain a bit more about that? Because I think some of your images were great examples of it, but I think hearing a bit more would be useful.
All right. Well, my own training, first of all, is as a painter more than a photographer. I've studied far more about painting than photography, and I do suggest that photographers who are interested in looking at great examples of things cast their net more widely than just photography. Besides Ansel Adams and Edward Weston, you should be looking at Claude Monet and Pablo Picasso. In terms of my own work, the primary tool I use is Photoshop with some Photoshop plugins, the Nik plugins, the Topaz plugins. I also use sometimes Corel Painter. So digital painting involves many different things and involves digital paintbrushes and other techniques. I do have a good amount of this kind of documented in some of my books, specifically the Photoshop Darkroom from Focal Press. It also involves compositing, and the image that's up on the screen is a pretty good example of that, because obviously we have a spiral staircase and a spiral nautilus blended together in a way that is a composition you wouldn't see in nature. Good question, thank you. Jeremy, do you have another question for me?
Another one which is linked. Someone says that they just want to take photographs, but how important is learning about both using a computer and software to being a photographer?
Well, you know, that's another great question. To my mind, that depends upon what kind of photographer you want to be. It also goes back in the history of photography to how important is darkroom work. Now, for a photographer like Ansel Adams, his darkroom work was absolutely critical. He could not have done what he did without darkroom work. If you look at, if you take there's a really famous there's a shot of Ansel Adams' really famous Moonrise over Hernandez done by a photographer named Jim Allender that shows what a standard print off that negative would look like and what his final famous image looked like. And if you saw the standard print off that, you would never look at it twice. So darkroom work was extremely important there. However, another famous photographer, Henri Cartier-Bresson, who was a little more of a street photographer or photojournalist, never printed anything in his life. He worked with technicians who made his prints, which now sell for a great deal of money. So for one of these guys, darkroom work was really important, and for another, it wasn't. For me, Photoshop is and other post-production tools is immensely important and part of what I do. Some of what I do is actually more Photoshop and digital art than photography. On the other hand, some images I do are mostly photographic. So I think both are important. I am not a believer in the you fix it in Photoshop's school of thought, but I am a believer that it's an important and valuable tool for creating art. On the other hand there is that some of my work doesn't end up looking exactly like photography. I believe this is a new art form and it's a great thing and a great potential. I was a photographer before there were digital tools, and I like the photography with digital tools much better. On the other hand, for you, if that's not your gift and if you don't care about working in the computer and you can make great images just in your camera, well then go to it. More power to you. There's nobody out there who should be able to tell you what to do other than you yourself. Jeremy, why don't we take one more question if it's there, and then I'll move on.
Okay, you've mentioned a really wide range of photographers. A question that's come in says, you've mentioned great photographers of the last century. Who do you think is the photographer's photographer?
Well, you know, that's sort of what. Thank you for the question. That's sort of what you would say. My joke about that is that's a, you know, do you beat your wife kind of question, because, or does my wife beat me? Because I can't win. I'm not about to name the photographers who are in some sense my competitors that I think are great or not great. There are some good people working out there. The thing that I do believe firmly is that, in fact, the connection between digital post-production and photography has not begun to be exploited in the way that it will be as happens going into the future. And there's a huge opportunity for people who can see and work innovatively and understand how to merge the creative arts into technology and what they do. You know, as someone who wants to send me an email privately, I might say, well, here are some other photographers who I like, but I'm not going to offend people working out there by leaving them off the list. There's some very good people working. And everybody who works well is different, in point of fact. Again, the question also would be really not who I like so much as who you like, because your taste and your vision is about you, not about me. So in some ways, with this question of goals, and it's related to overcoming resistance, what you have to begin doing is something like a business-like approach. You have to be organized about this. You have to say, what are my goals in life and photography? Let's list them out. Let's make a plan for how to get there. Let's perhaps put that plan in writing and get somebody who's a friend or maybe a mentor to see it, to understand it, to keep me honest. And how do I get from here to there? And then what I try to do in workshops, when I run a long-term workshop to help people with this, is to do some kind of group support and checking that people are following their plans. I'm showing these pictures from parts of France because one of my goals was to get to Europe and photograph it, and I figured out how to do that and achieved it. Another goal of mine was to photograph the pilgrimage trails in Japan, and this is a shot from along the Kimono Kodo of what's called the view of 10,000 peaks. I can't promise there are 10,000, but there are a lot of them. So I'm going to get back to this a little bit more, but you really need, in some ways, to use the non-artistic part of your brain and personality to make an idea of where you want to go, how you're going to get there, and then you have to follow it up. And personally, I believe there are many easier ways to make a living than with photography, and that's probably true of art in general. So why does one do it? Why do I do it? Why do you do it? One reason is you get to be in places like the top of Lambert Dome shown here at sunset. It's a good excuse for exploring all kinds of things. Another reason I personally love photography is because it lets me make things that are just gorgeous objects, like this copy of the limited edition artist book my wife and I created called Botanique. And it's a pleasure to me to be part of the craft of making handmade objects. So that's part of it for me. Photography is about light. Even the word photography is means capturing light, writing with light. So this shot here, you wouldn't know exactly what it is except for the pew benches in the upper right, and it's showing patterns of light and dark on the aisle of this church. I'm including it here because part of what I love about photography is that it lets me relate to one of the fundamental forms in the universe, namely light. And I also like photography because it lets me explore the patterns that are present in the universe, like the chambered nautilus. How do you become a more creative photographer? Well, you know, you look and you see, you photograph things you love, you understand what you love about photography, and I'm quickly rolling through some of the things that I love here, namely flowers and colors. You look at things that are everyday objects and you say, how can I photograph this in a different way? A question you might ask yourself when you look at this image of an egg slicer, first of all, what is the image about? Well, like the image with the pews and the lights and the darks, it's really about the shadows and the lighting of this. Then, how could I have arranged this egg slicer so it seems to be floating in midair against its shadow? If you think about it, that's a bit of a puzzle, and I'm not actually going to give the answer right now. So for the person who asked the question about how much of my work is digital post-production, this is an image that obviously is both photographic and Photoshop, because the ocean scene that's in the supposed shadow of the marble, you know, of course it could not have been there naturally. On the other hand, the only way to generate an image like that of a marble with a shadow is photographically and in a fairly technically sophisticated way as well, because it's a larger than one-to-one macro. Poor Vincent van Gogh, one of my great artistic heroes, spent the last days of his life in a suburb, in what's now a suburb of Paris, a place called Auvers-sur-Oise, on the Oise River. And you go there, and it's not quite the tourist shrine that Monet's Garden at Giverny is, but they do have these signs showing his paintings of the related objects that are around this town. So I thought it was really kind of funny here to produce an image that on the left side was a Photoshop replica of almost Van Gogh-like brush strokes, and on the right side was a really straight photo of the tourist sign from the scene. How do you get time to do what you need to do to take your photo to the next level? If the one thing that's short is time, then how do you make time to do it? Well, you know, the truth is that who in this world of ours, we're all busy, but who in this world of ours really uses all their time to the fullest? You know, a lot of I have a pretty full life. I write books. I've published 17 books that are about or related to photography. I take pictures, I have assignments, I lead workshops, I have 4 kids. You know, the kids go to bed, I put my headset on, I put some nice music on, and I go to work. So, you know, this is an issue of doing things one step at a time and perhaps finding where you could be a little more creative and find the time to do what you need. This is an image that is a from sunset to sunrise with the camera on an intervalometer, a programmable interval timer, and it's about 14 hours of shots that are combined together. Here's another resistance issue. I feel if I could just master Photoshop, my work will be good enough to share. Yeah, I don't take the time to master Photoshop. I feel that my work is not good enough to share. I have heard this story many, many, many times in my workshops, over and over and over again. If you really feel that there's one thing, perhaps mastering Photoshop, that you need to do to make your work good, then just do it. Once you achieve your first set of goals, then what you need to do is find the next set of goals. The trick here is to create an action plan. The action plan should be detailed, and as I've said before, you need to have support in the form preferably of a group of peers, people who are about the same place you are, who will help see and verify that you've actually done it. It's not a sin, week to week if you don't do what was in your plan, but you just need to know that you have to do it and you have to put it out next week. I mean, that's why for kids they have homework, God forbid, and for adults, if you want to get somewhere, well, no one is going to do the work for you. So if you take away one message from this webinar, please take away the sort of slogan, go out, just do it. There is no try. Do or do not, there is no try. Lists are great. My life is full of to-do lists. I love crossing them off. I write the to-do lists in a black pen. I cross them off with a red pen. It gives me great pleasure to cross them off. But you know what? I'm human. Sometimes some things never go off my list. I never do everything I want to do. And isn't that a great thing? Isn't it wonderful in life to have things that one aims at that one hasn't accomplished? Or as somebody put it, a man's reach should be bigger than their grasp, or else what is a metaphor? The image here, by the way, is of course my eye, photoshopped into a flower stalk on the beach. So the question becomes, how do you put the pieces together? And the answer there is you do it carefully. You think about, you work hard to become a person whose goals and visions are in line with the kind of work that you create, and you think about the best way to put your work out there so that it will make sense. The answer there is not a simple answer, and there are no easy ways to do things, but it's really, really a challenge and task that's worth the game. And I'm going to open the session to questions, and I'm going to say that I hope that this webinar has been at least a bit helpful in explaining and showing a path that can be taken for each and every one of the people listening to deepen their own work and make valuable work. Because this world of ours, we look around and there's so much going on that is not to like. I don't understand why people are so greedy, but every time a person says, I'm going to create something that's beautiful or striking or tells an interesting story and is art, then something wonderful has happened and it makes the world a better place. So thank you very much. Jeremy, do you have some questions for me?
Thank you very much, Harold. Yes, I have a number of questions, and we have time for them before our 6 o'clock finish. So there's a wonderful question which I'll read in full. It's a question from a serious amateur with decent technical knowledge but self-taught. For me, the need to master the technical and equipment aspect of photography is sometimes overwhelming. I hear about people who have taken up photography with full-time jobs only 2 years ago and have an amazing depth of technical know-how. How do you achieve the potential you're speaking about, Harold, without getting bogged down in technical and equipment aspect, even though it's very important? What is the right balance as you are learning?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not sure there's an easy answer to it because it's going to depend on the individual and the individual situation. I will say, though, that I think that technical knowledge is not as important as spirit. Okay, I mean, I hope that's come across loud and clear in this presentation. One of my photographic buddies had put it this way. He said that a lousy picture that's got good meaning and spiritual nature to it is going to beat a technically perfect but banal image any time. And that's really true. It's absolutely true. I mean, an out of focus iPhone shot that is great, that looks kind of awful but has some great idea and great meaning behind it is going to be more compelling than a technically perfect studio shot that's used to sell a hamburger anytime. So I think that the thing to really look at is how do you keep yourself interested, enthusiastic, artistic, and spiritual in your work, and then you pick up the technical stuff on the fly as you go along. That's probably the best approach. I mean, truthfully, I don't think somebody in 2 years with a full-time job has picked up everything they need to know technically about photography, because learning technically about photography and about the post-production aspects of today's photography is a very, very ambitious endeavor, and I find myself that I'm constantly learning in it. But then again, the constant learning is a good part of the fun. Thanks. So what have we got next there, Jeremy?
Thanks, Harold. We've got another question. We've got another question regarding resistance. How do you pluck up the courage to share or show your work to anyone?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Okay, so one technique here is, and I use this a lot in my life, is what's the worst that can happen? Okay, so what's the worst that can happen when you show your work to somebody? They can laugh. They can say, "Oh my God, Seymour, that's a terrible photo. What a disgusting print. How could you waste my time showing it to me?" Okay, are they going to do these things? Are they going to laugh? Are they going to mock you? Probably not, particularly if you start by showing them to friends. Actually, what happens, which is almost as bad, is unless you're very careful about where you show work, you don't get honest feedback. People don't want to offend you. They don't want to hurt you. They know that you've put your heart and soul into it, so you don't really get an honest critique. So in some ways, finding an honest critique is a harder problem. So what's the worst that can happen is a great question to ask. Not much is really the answer. Okay, the worst that can probably happen is you won't get a reaction, your prints won't sell on the wall, and so on. Now, there's a real issue here because I've advised people to try to put their soul, their heart, their intellect on the line in photos and art. If you can't show something and revealing of yourself, then why are you doing this? So if your work is rejected, if it's not sold, if it's not commented on, if God forbid somebody makes fun of it or says nasty things, then they're rejecting you in some ways, and that is true. But the chance of rejection is something that happens to all of us in life. You never meet somebody of your preferred gender if you don't try a lot of times and get rejected sometimes. Obviously, my work has some quality that there are people out there who appreciate, but it's a true fact of my professional life that I get rejected in some way every week. Mostly I have to, and that's true at this point in my career. It was certainly true back earlier. The first major exhibition I had at a 57th Street gallery in New York, a major photographic publication, wrote a review that fundamentally slammed it. It hurt. I didn't like it. Perhaps I learned from it. But I picked up and moved on. So I think what you have to say is that whoever you are and whatever you do, if you put yourself out there in whatever endeavor, you're going to get some rejections. I mean, it's a corollary of to find a prince, you have to kiss a lot of frogs. And sort of, so what? The place you need to get to is to know the merit of what you do for yourself. and hopefully also to know where it can be improved as well as the merit, and to work hard in a genuine way at improving the bad things, but to not take the rejection for more than the reactions of ignorant people, if that's what they are. Or, you know, there's taste too. It's not to somebody's taste. That's fine. Well, maybe it is to somebody else's taste. And part of kissing a lot of frogs is getting it out there till you find the people who do like it. Thanks for the question. Good one.
Thanks very much, Harold. I think we've got time for maybe 2 more short questions. One that's come in is saying that you've shown photographs from all around the world. Is it necessary to travel to make great photographs?
Oh, great question. And the answer is an emphatic no. Very important point for me. Really, my photographs started to be from different points of the world only fairly recently. A lot of my best work is shot right at home, flowers. I did one I'm really proud of last year that's light coming through a Venetian blind in black and white. I'm a great believer that there's no need to go anyplace exotic to take pictures. I mean, there is this saying, and it's a true saying, want to take more interesting photos, then put yourself in front of more interesting things. But there's so many interesting things that are at home. What could be more interesting than what my kids do, for example? Or what could be more interesting than the internal parts of a flower? And you can find a flower anywhere. So no, absolutely no need to travel. It's a fringe benefit that, for me, that I've begun to be a bit more recognized in my work, and that I therefore do get to travel and do these at exotic places. But honestly, a lot of what I look for when I travel are not the things that are the tourist places or shots, but more like, hey, what does it look like looking at heating ducts out the back window of a hotel in a courtyard or something like that. So yes, travel is fun and I enjoy it to a point, but no, absolutely not necessary for making great images. Thanks. You got one more for me, Jeremy?
Thanks, Harold. And a last one in the last couple of minutes. Just a question saying, Harold, do you ever deliver workshops where people could learn a bit more about your ideas and techniques and approach?
Oh, thanks so much for asking that. Absolutely, I do workshops in both here in California and also in various other places, including Germany, and I'm going to be doing a flower photography workshop at the main media session in this coming summer. And please check out my website and my email subscription list for more information about that. Thanks.
Thanks, Harold. That was great. Well, it just remains for me to say a big thank you to you, Harold, for an excellent presentation. Thank you to everyone who's attended. Thank you for your time and your engagement, and we hope to see you again in future Focal Press or Taylor and Francis webinars